thing. Well, okay, it's working. Okay, so we take the questions and we shuffle them around. What is that? Oh. Okay. Okay, this is a difficult question. Is it imperative to have faith in karma and reincarnation, or let's say rebirth, to attain enlightenment? From my understanding, the Buddha discovered these factors through meditation. I have not meditated well enough to believe with certainty, but many Dhamma followers insist it is wrong view to not be certain of karma. Okay, what I say is, if one has doubts or is not ready to accept the teaching of karma and rebirth, one shouldn't give up on the Buddha's teaching and say, therefore, let me just make... Okay, I'll just go over that again. Let me read the question again so it gets recorded. That was my lack of mindfulness. I didn't press the record button. So the question, first question, is it imperative to have faith in karma and rebirth in order to attain enlightenment? From my understanding, the Buddha discovered these factors through meditation. I have not meditated well enough to believe with certainty, but many Dhamma followers insist it is wrong view to not be certain of karma. Okay, so what I say is, if one is not able to place faith in the teaching of karma and rebirth, one shouldn't give up on the Dhamma and say, therefore, the teaching is useless for me. The only benefit or purpose in practicing the Dhamma is to gain liberation from the cycle of rebirths, and since I don't believe in these teachings, there's no purpose for me practicing. What I say is that the teaching of the Buddha has benefits which are visible here and now, and benefits that come in future lives, and then the ultimate benefit of liberation. So if one has sort of skeptical doubt about these teachings of karma and rebirth, take the teachings of the Buddha, the practices of the Dhamma that you see to be beneficial to yourself here and now. And I mean, I don't have personal confirmation of the teachings of karma and rebirth myself. You could say, I haven't meditated well enough to realize these teachings or these principles. But I have trust in the truth of these teachings, because from what I've practiced, I found to be beneficial and to be true, valid, and beneficial. And I see that these teachings are coming from the Buddha, who has taught the operation of karma, the reality of rebirth. And so I place trust in the Buddha on that basis. But if one is not yet ready to accept these teachings fully, just take what you can see and validate for yourself here and now. In fact, the Buddha uses this approach in a famous sutta called the Kalama Sutta, in which there are a group of people from a community, they're called the Kalamas. They come to the Buddha and they say that they have doubts about these teachings of karma and rebirth. They've heard about them, but they can't confirm them for themselves. So the Buddha says, don't worry about this. But what do you think, he says, when greed, hatred, delusion arise in your mind, does it create lack of inner peace, a lack of inner harmony, Does it create conflict, displeasure, pain and suffering for yourself? And does it motivate you to act in ways that are harmful to others? So the people say, yes, that is the case. So the Buddha says, in that case, you could see greed, hate, and delusion create harm for yourself, harm for others. Then you should practice to overcome them. And when good qualities arise, the qualities we call good, like generosity, loving kindness, understanding, compassion, helpfulness to others, are those beneficial to yourself? Do they create ease of mind, peace, happiness within yourself? Yes. And do they motivate you to act in ways that are beneficial to others? Yes. And so the Buddha says, then you should develop those wholesome qualities, those good qualities. So if one is not yet ready to place complete trust in these teachings of karma and rebirth, work with the principles of the Dhamma that you can see and validate for yourself. And is it wrong view not to be certain of karma? That itself is not wrong view. The wrong view is to deny the workings of karma and rebirth, where you don't have a definite proof that there's no karma, no rebirth. And so somebody who goes around, and this was more true, I say, in the Buddha's time than today, somebody who goes around saying that there's no fruit and result of good and bad deeds, there's no life beyond the present one. In the Buddha's time, that was pretty much the mark of a person who's inclined to immoral ways of behavior. Now I have to say, because of the influence of materialistic science, so a lot of people with a scientific background will say that a human being consists essentially of this physical organism. The mind or consciousness is just a byproduct of bodily material processes. And so when the body dies, consciousness comes to an end. There's no survival in any form, no results of our good and bad deeds. So if they're saying that on the basis of what, let's say, the scientific worldview, I say it's not a right view, and to some extent it's a wrong view, but I don't want to say that it's a wrong view in that very powerful sense in which statements like that would have had in the Buddha's time, when that was the mark of a person who wanted to undermine the foundations of morality. There are many people with scientific backgrounds who won't accept the idea of survival beyond death, any kind of retribution, moral retribution for our deeds, but they still think on the basis of moral reflection that it's important to act in morally responsible ways, in ethically upright way, in ethically upright ways, even when, from a Buddhist point of view, we would say that their judgment is incorrect. Okay, so that is my way of dealing with that question. Okay, question number 2. Okay, this is about rebirth in the pure abodes. I don't think I dealt with this in today's class. Yeah, the question should really, I'll answer the question, but the question should really be relevant to the to the subject matter of the lectures during the course of the day. Can one who attains the first or second jhanas be reborn in the pure abodes, even though the pure abodes are for non-returners who have attained the third jhana? Okay, the pure abodes, these are the abodes of rebirth reserved for non-returners. So if one is not a non-returner, one can't be reborn in the pure abodes. Only only non-returners can be reborn in the pure abodes. The pure abodes actually correspond to the fourth jhana. And it's still even a question in my mind, can one who doesn't attain the fourth jhana be reborn in the pure abodes? Because it seems non-returners, they won't be reborn in the sense sphere realm of existence. They'll be reborn in the form realm. But maybe not necessarily, it's not necessarily the case that they'll be reborn in the pure abodes. They might be reborn elsewhere in the form realm, and possibly the pure abodes are reserved for the non-returners who attain the fourth jhana, possibly. But I think the dominant position within the Theravada commentarial tradition is that any non-returners can be reborn in the pure abodes. It's not reserved for those who attain the fourth jhana. Okay, could you please explain karma ripens in the field of karma with an example from the sensory realm? I think maybe this will become clearer tomorrow. Is it tomorrow? Yeah, I think tomorrow we'll be dealing more with the workings of karma and its fruit through the different types of consciousness. So let me sort of table this question, and if I don't answer it satisfactorily tomorrow, you could raise it again tomorrow evening. Okay, this looks like a long one. Let's see. Okay, know there are a lot of aggregated combos of form and consciousness, also known as beings, but if they become disaggregated through nirvana, won't there eventually be no more beings? Or can new beings come into existence from rocks or something and replace those who have become disaggregated by attaining nirvana? Either way, it seems either to come to an end or to go on forever, which seems to be nihilism or eternalism. Okay, there's actually several questions here. Okay, so if beings enter into nirvana, so eventually won't it be the case that, yeah, here maybe we have 5 or 6 beings left. And then they debate who's going to attain nirvana. And eventually 2 or 3 left. Which one of us is going to attain nirvana? Flip a coin. Yeah. There's a sutta go, yeah. There's a sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya where somebody comes to the Buddha, a wandering ascetic, and says, is it the case that eventually all the world will attain nirvana? The Buddha remains silent. Then he says, is it the case that eventually half the world will attain nirvana? The Buddha remains silent. Then he asks, is it the case that eventually 1/4 of the world will attain nirvana? The Buddha remains silent. And then the wanderer gets discouraged and turns away. And then Ananda catches up with him because he's afraid that the wanderer will think that the Buddha doesn't know the answer. And then Ananda explains that the Buddha is not concerned with whether the whole world will attain nirvana, or half the world, or a quarter of the world, or anything less. But what he's concerned with is the path to nirvana. And he knows that whatever beings attain nirvana will attain it by overcoming the 5 hindrances of the mind, cultivating the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and developing the 7 factors of enlightenment. I didn't really answer the questions. Okay, but sentient beings are said to be in number infinite, inexhaustible. So even if billions and billions and billions of beings are liberated into the unconditioned nirvana element, there will still be beings around wandering through samsara. How it's possible over infinite time, it seems an infinite number of beings have to attain nirvana, but there'll still be an infinite number of beings who haven't. How this works, it's the mathematics of infinity, I don't know. But it's not the case, or at least in my understanding, that inanimate objects, like, what does the question say? Can new beings come into existence from rocks and replace those who have attained nirvana? In my understanding, it's not possible for rocks to turn into sentient beings and then start migrating through the cycle of birth and death until they attain nirvana. Whether beings can come into existence that haven't existed before, I haven't seen any statement to that effect in the suttas, but whether it's possible or impossible, I don't know. Okay, next question. Okay, this is a good one. Can you please clarify why the sutta uses the expression teaching by the middle and not the middle way? What is the difference? Yeah, so actually what's translated as the middle way what's called the middle, okay, I was typing it thinking that the projector was on. Not necessary. So the Pali word is majjhima patipada. So the word patipada means a way that one actually walks. In other words, it's a practice, a way of practice. And so what the Buddha calls the majjhima patipada, the middle way or the middle path, is the Noble Eightfold Path, because that is a way of practice. And it's called the middle way because it avoids 2 extremes, 2 extreme ways of practice, which were current amongst, even amongst the ascetics of the Buddha's time. So one is the way of indulgence in sensual pleasures. So this, the Buddha says, it's the inappropriate way for those who have gone forth into the homeless life. So he doesn't say that all of his disciples have to give up sensual pleasures, but those who have gone forth have to avoid the extreme of sensual indulgence. But even for householders, there has to be some restraint regarding sensual pleasures. And then the other extreme is the extreme of self-mortification. And that was very widespread in India, northern India during the Buddha's time, and even in India today amongst many of the ascetics. This is the way they practice by undertaking these long fasts, sleeping on thorns, subjecting the body to extremes of heat and cold. So the Buddha taught the middle way, which avoids these 2 extremes and which allows the practitioner to maintain the body in a healthy condition which avoids inflicting deliberate pain on the body. So one is to live pleasantly and happily, but avoiding the indulgence and sensual pleasures. So that is the way for the Buddhist renunciants. So this is the middle way of practice. But that is different from the teaching of dependent origination, which is not a way of practice, but it's a way of understanding. And so the Buddha calls this the middle Dhamma, or the Dhamma that goes in the middle, because it avoids the two extreme views of eternalism, which is a kind of affirmation of existence, and annihilationism, which is the view of non-existence, aiming at non-existence. And so the middle view, or middle Dhamma of dependent origination, teaches how phenomena arise based upon conditions through the operation of conditions, and cease with the stopping of the conditions. So that's the difference between the middle way, which is, or the middle way of practice, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, and the Dhamma that goes in the middle, avoiding the extremes of eternalism and annihilationism, and that is dependent origination. And maybe I'll come back to this once we finish the written questions. Okay, a question about the use of literary formulas in the suttas. Okay, for example, in the Great Bonfire, the Buddha describes identically the number of wagon loads and types of fuels twice. Okay, is this an interpolation into the text to make it easier to memorize? Or do you think the Buddha taught using repeated phrases or something else? Let me just see what this... Okay. Oh, I see. Referring to the 10, 20, 30, or 40 loads of wood. Yeah, in this case, I think both of these alternatives is correct. First, I think that the Buddha probably taught using repeated phrases because the two, the simile is the same in both cases. It's just in one case, he's describing how the bonfire keeps burning, and in the other case, how the bonfire goes out. So it's natural that he will use the same phrases. But also in the text, throughout the text, one finds a lot of repetition, even to the point that some people complain about the Pali Suttas being so repetitive, so boring. Okay, because of so much repetition. We have to remember that the Pali Suttas were originally orally transmitted documents, orally transmitted texts, but document and text already implies something that's written, orally transmitted accounts of the Buddha's teaching. So during the first 300, 400 years of Buddha's history, the discourses were not written down, but they had to be memorized. Like there would be companies or groups of monks who would specialize in memorizing sets of discourses, and then they would take on groups of students, and they would teach the discourses to their students who didn't have the way we now have paper and written versions of the suttas, but they would have to learn orally from their teacher and memorize the teachings. rehearsing them over and over and over till they get it by memory. And then when they get older, then they take on their students and teach to their students. So if you have something like a modern novel or even like a modern history textbook, and you want to transmit that, to memorize that and transmit it, unless you have a super memory, very, very difficult to do. But in the case of the suttas, I think the Buddha taught deliberately in a way to make it easier to memorize with a lot of repetition. And probably the compilers of the texts would also repeat whole passages in order to impress the teachings on their own memories and to make it easier for their students to memorize. Okay, this question a little similar to one that we already had. If one of the results of Nibbana is the ending of rebirth, and if every human being on earth was enlightened, would that mean that there would be no more human births and rebirths, and the human population on earth would become zero? Every human being on earth, or even let's say in America, were to achieve perfect health, which they could sustain through their whole lifetime, so that all diseases were to be cured, and every human being were to enjoy perfect health through their whole lifetime. All of the hospitals would go out of business. all of the people who spent years and lots of money studying to become doctors would become unemployed. Okay, so my answer to that conundrum is, don't worry. If you are planning to go to medical school or working in a hospital, don't worry that you're going to lose your job. Hospitals will always be functioning. There'll always be a need for more doctors and other hospital personnel. So it'll never be the case that every human being on earth becomes enlightened. Let's just hope that enough human beings become wise enough to use the resources of the earth in a prudent way, so that we don't overexhaust our resources and precipitate such disastrous climate catastrophes that we lose our human population, not because they've gone into nirvana, but because they've been destroyed by climate catastrophes. Okay. Okay, thinking about the knowledge of entailment. How can we work with both the idea of specific conditionality and the variable sequencing presented in some suttas? What exactly do all the enlightened stream enters in the past, future, and present see in common? I'm not sure apart from the second part of the question, but as for the first part, I'm not quite sure that I understand. Let me see if I understand correctly, and the person who asked the question, if you don't consider it a very personal, confidential matter, you could tell me if I get it right. Okay, so we have specific conditionality saying A is the condition for B. So we see this in the 12-fold formula of dependent origination. ignorance, the condition for sankharas, sankharas, the condition for consciousness, consciousness for name and form. So that is the specific conditionality. But we see in other suttas, and some that I pointed out, that the sequence is sometimes jumbled up so that you get, in one sutta, I think we took the one on the simile of the painter, 64. Where we have consciousness and name and form coming before the growth of volitional formation. So it's a change of sequence. Yeah, so is that the intention of the question? You asked it. Yeah, if we have the wireless microphone someplace.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to be unclear. But before we were talking about the knowledge from inference that every person in the past and future who understood this understood it in the exact same way, and the way was specific conditionality. But then we looked at other ways that it can work or be understood. So do all the people in the past and future who are understanding the same thing underneath, what are they understanding?
Yeah, what I would say that they understand, and this is my inference, not from direct knowledge, is that what they would understand would be the standard 12-fold formula of dependent origination. But actually, even that 12-fold formula is in a way, I would say, in elaboration, sort of what's the underlying principle behind dependent origination is from defilements, this is taking ignorance, craving, and clinging together, come karmic activities, wholesome and unwholesome karmic activities, and then these defilements together with the karmic activities bring about the arising of consciousness and name and form. That is the factors that constitute the new existence. That, I would say, is the essence of dependent origination. That, I think, is what is understood. And the presentation in 12-fold formula is just an elaboration of that. Okay, the doctrine of dependent origination presupposes the existence of time and space. The teaching by the middle says views about the existence of the world are not correct. So there seems to be, I guess, the questioner sees some kind of contradiction here. But I think I should have clarified what is meant by views about about existence. It's not denying the existence of anything present in the world. It's not saying that there is no bottle of water here, no you and me here in the world. But what's meant by the view of existence is the view which holds that there is some kind of eternal self within the individual. It's the view which asserts that there is a self, some kind of nucleus of personal identity within the individual, and some kind of eternal ground or reality behind the world, either a divine creator, what we call God, or in the Upanishadic doctrine, something like a Brahman, an ground, a fundamental ground out of which the world arises. So dependent origination denies the existence of an eternal self and an eternal ground for the world, because everything that pertains to the individual is a conditioned phenomena that arises through the operation of conditions. So experience occurs as a process, ever-changing process arising through the interplay of consciousness and name and form with the objects that impinge on consciousness. So the teaching of dependent origination is not denying the existence of these conditioned phenomena, but the existence of conditioned phenomena is always a temporary existence, phenomena arising, persisting momentarily, and then vanishing in accordance with conditions. And so then there's no contradiction between the teaching of the middle and the existence of time and space as the background for dependent origination. Okay, somebody says, can we please do a guided meditation? Okay, we could do a guided loving kindness meditation. Wait, I think he's passing to you. Yeah. Speak loudly.
Not connected directly to Paticca Samuppada.
Excuse me?
My layman's understanding, the middle path. He was a prince and then he was an ascetic, starving himself, the Buddha, in his lifetime.
Yeah.
So I can relate to the middle path.
Yeah.
Between the, but when it comes to the Noble Eightfold Path,
No.
it's Sammaditthi Samma Sankappa,
Yeah.
which says the right view and
Yeah.
right distance, right?
Yeah.
So there's no, in that case it will be a question of right and wrong. So there is no question of a middle there. Although we say the Noble Eightfold Path is the middle,
Yeah.
I couldn't see that as a middle. It's one path, that's it.
No, it's called the middle path
Yeah.
because in fact, the sutta says that.
Yeah.
It's the middle path that avoids the two extremes. And the two extremes are, on the one hand, indulgence in sensual pleasures. The other is
Yeah,
the
that I
practice
can-
of self-mortification. That's what's meant by the middle path.
Okay, because I mean, it's a matter of right and wrong, like right
Yeah.
path,
Yeah.
not right. Okay. Thank you, Bhante.
Okay. Okay, so the person says, I find this sutta very clear and practical. That is the sutta on the origin and passing away of the world. So the diagrams, the visual object, contact, eye consciousness. In other suttas, instead, we have volitional formations, leading to consciousness, to name and form, to six sense bases. And so the way dependent origination is explained, especially regarding consciousness, is different and almost contradicting the previous sutta on the origin and passing away of the world. Can you please reconcile the two presentations? Okay, this interesting question. Okay, the way I see it, let's take the question, the sutta on the arising and passing of the world. Okay, so here in dependence on the eye and form, forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, feeling comes to be. With feeling as condition, craving, and so on. Okay, so this sutta is starting from the standpoint where we have a person who is already, let us say, embodied or existing in the world, equipped with the 6 sense bases. So here we have the 6 sense bases are already present, and the 6 sense bases provide the occasion for contact to take place. Actually, I didn't get that right. Okay, so these 6 sense bases provide the condition for particular types of consciousness to arise. Okay, but for these particular types of consciousness to arise, when I see a form, eye consciousness arises. When I hear a sound, ear consciousness arises. If I taste a drink, a tasting tongue consciousness will arise. So those are particular types of active sensory consciousness that are arising. But those types of active sensory consciousness emerge out of what I call the underlying subliminal flow of consciousness, which we're going to come to tomorrow. This is what is called the bhavanga, the sort of subconscious flow of consciousness. And that flow, underlying subliminal consciousness, the bhavanga, begins with the event of rebirth linking, the rebirth linking consciousness. So what the link in dependent origination with sankhara as condition, there is consciousness. This is showing that it is the volitional activities of the past existence that bring into being consciousness, the first moment of consciousness at the very beginning of this life. And then it's that subliminal flow of consciousness that maintains the continuity of personal identity through the whole course of life. And that subliminal consciousness is the result of the sankharas, the volitional activities of our past life and earlier past lives. And so out of that passive flow of consciousness, when there is the encounter with sensory objects, then depending upon the sense object that impinges, the appropriate specific type of sense consciousness will arise. If a form strikes the eye, eye consciousness will arise. If there's a more prominent sound, ear consciousness will arise. But whenever there's no active sensory consciousness going on, then there occurs that deep flow of the basic consciousness, the substratum consciousness, the bhavanga. And that is what is produced by the sankharas of the past. And in fact, even the sensory consciousness of the present, technically, from the Abhidhamma standpoint, these are results of sankharas, also results of sankharas from the past. So those we'll see this in greater detail tomorrow and the day after, how sankharas from the past bring into being both the subconscious or substratum consciousness, the bhavanga, and also the passive sensory types of consciousness. Okay, so these were the questions that had been placed on the table. Do we have any questions coming up? Okay, please. Do you have the microphone? Yeah, she's going to give you the microphone.
All right, thank you. I don't really have a question, just need to elaborate. Earlier you talked about the 4 types of nutriment.
Right.
Edible food,
yeah.
contact, mental violation, and consciousness.
Yeah.
And then you went into 4 types of existence, trying to explain those 4 types of nutriments. But if I'm correct, you also said consciousness somehow plays a major role into those 4 types of nutriments.
Consciousness plays a major role?
Into those 4 types of nutriments.
Yeah. Yeah, an interesting point. Consciousness is one.
Maybe I had it down wrong.
One, two, okay. Yeah, let's just take a look at that. Number 64, okay. Okay, I think I see the problem that you're pointing to. Okay, we have these 4 nutriments, and so one of them is consciousness itself. And so, let's go down. So if there is lust for the nutriment consciousness, if there is delight, if there is craving, consciousness becomes established there and comes to growth. So it seems like consciousness is feeding on consciousness. Is that the point you're making? Yeah, so it seems, I would say that's a possibility, that it's like when one takes delight in one's own experience of consciousness, then consciousness is sort of growing on that conscious experience. That's the way I would understand it.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think, is that Suki? My vision is not so sharp in the back.
Just to clarify one sentence in one of the sutras,
Yeah.
the wise and the fool.
The what?
The wise and the fool
Yeah,
that we did. Samyutta Nikaya 12:19.
yeah,
The second line, so there is this body
yeah,
and the external name and form,
yeah.
that's this diet. Any special meaning with the external?
Yeah, I have to say that's it's a problematic phrase for myself too. Let's just get it. Oh, it's not being projected. I keep on thinking it's being projected. Okay. Yeah, it's a rather unusual use. It's a very unusual expression, external name and form, because usually we think of name and form as the form as being the physical body, one's own physical body, and name as being those group of mental factors that go along with consciousness. But here it seems almost as if the text is using an older meaning for the expression name and form. A use of that expression, name and form, that one finds in the Vedic literature, the older literature of India, of northern India, where name and form is referring to the objective field. So the objective field, we have the forms of the things that we see, and then the names are the designations that we apply to the things that we see, hear, smell, and so on. And so it seems to be an older usage of the expression name and form than the typical expression that we find elsewhere in the suttas, particularly in the analysis of dependent origination, where the Buddha defines name as being feeling, perception, volition, contact, and attention, and form as being the four great elements and the derived matter. Yeah, this might be the only passage in the suttas where we find name and form used in that sense. Yeah, okay, please.
Thank you, Bhante. Just a clarification on the 12 links of dependent origination.
The term?
The 12 links of
The 12
dependent
link, yeah.
origination. As you explained, you separated into two cycles. One from ignorance to name and form, and another one from craving to birth, aging, and death.
Yeah.
What would be the purpose of separating the 12 links into these two cycles instead of, for example, interpolating the two cycles into one big cycle that includes all steps? Is there a difference between the first and the second? Is it approaching different aspects?
What I would say is that the two lines that I drew or depicted, the two lines that I depicted are running parallel. So there are different ways of saying the same thing, and one puts the emphasis on ignorance as the starting point. The other puts the emphasis on craving and clinging as the starting point. But we're going to see on the last day of this retreat how we bring all 12 of these together into a rather more complex structure in which, how did you put that? You have the whole thing, all of them working together in sequences. Not even separated into 12, but now expanding into 20, which are working together in groups.
Thank you, Bhante.
Okay, over here to my right.
Thank you. I guess my question, it came up when we were talking about the middle way in between non-existence and eternal existence. I think it's always kind of an interesting thing to consider with like Buddhism and the idea of divinity.
The idea of what?
Divinity.
Divinity,
Yeah. And I guess just basically, would the Buddha have considered the universe, consciousness and existence itself to be inherently divine in its nature, or more so devoid of like an essential meaning or divinity?
Certainly the Buddha didn't consider the universe in its totality to be divine. That was more the position, or at least from one angle, the position of the Upanishads. But he sees the universe as, let's say, a procession of conditioned phenomena which are governed by this invariable law of dependent origination. I don't know if that answers your question. You gave two alternatives. You said, does the Buddha see the universe in its totality as being divine, or what was the other?
I guess devoid of like an essential meaning or divinity.
Well, I would say that it's devoid of maybe any pre-given meaning, but as we move within the cycle of birth and death, we undergo the suffering of birth, growth, old age, sickness, and death. And the Buddha sees a state of liberation beyond and outside the conditioned universe. And so for the Buddha himself, that became the goal that he pursued and attained. And then when he established his teaching, that becomes the ultimate goal of his teaching.
Thank you.
Okay, we could take...
Wouldn't it be more correct to say that the universe is infinite possibility and not necessarily divinity or lack thereof? I mean,
I'm not sure what's
I don't
meant
know.
by
It just popped into my head, so it could just be garbage. But isn't it a matter of I don't know rather than I can be certain?
I have to say, I'm not quite sure I understand.
I'm going to have to reframe that tomorrow.
Okay.
I apologize. Thank
Okay. Okay, over here on.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah.
I hope I formulate this question well.
Okay.
So my understanding is that dependent origination was radical
Yeah.
in Buddha's time.
Oh, yeah.
So I wonder, can you elaborate on how exactly was it radical in his time, and how do you find it today in our time?
Okay, I think maybe when we say it was radical in the Buddha's time, I say it was probably a quite unique insight that phenomena arise in dependence on conditions, and that this principle of conditionality can explain the continuity of existence from life to life without presupposing a permanent, substantial self or soul as the agent of the process of continued existence. And so there are actually many different speculative philosophies current at the time of the Buddha, but most of them revolved in one way or another upon the assertion that there is some permanent, substantial self that undergoes repeated existence until it's liberated. And so the Buddha taught the continuity of existence without depending upon the affirmation of a substantial self. And so in that way, it sort of overturns, what makes it radical also is that it overturns our deeply ingrained clinging to the idea of a self within ourselves, the idea that the I is some kind of substantial reality. So that would make it radical in the Buddha's time, and perhaps also radical in our own time, even though with the development of scientific knowledge, so there's an understanding of conditionality. But what I would say is that the understanding of conditionality in mainstream science, it's adopted on the foundation of basically a materialistic metaphysic, that mind or consciousness is in some way a byproduct of material processes, whereas the Buddha's teaching of dependent origination is not materialistic. If anything, it gives more emphasis to the role of mind and consciousness as being the more fundamental condition out of which the world arises. Okay, we take one more question.
Yeah, I just was going to say that there was this philosopher in 8th century India. There was this philosopher called, in 8th century India, there was a philosopher called Shankara. He kind of like made Atman and Brahman together. He brought Atman, the idea of self or soul, and Brahman. He brought it together in Advaita Vedanta. So this is speculative. I don't know how Buddha would have approached the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta. I mean, he would have rejected Brahman. But then I suppose Shankara didn't have a chance with this Advaita Vedanta.
Well, actually, the ideas that were sort of synthesized and elaborated and systematized by Shankaracharya were already present during the Buddha's time in India in the teaching of the Upanishads. But we don't see in the Buddha's teaching that he had direct familiarity with the teachings of the Upanishads, with the assertion of the identity of the Atman with the Brahman. I haven't seen direct evidence for that in the Buddha's teaching. But I think the Buddha would be critical of the two poles in the position of Shankaracharya, the affirmation of the permanent self and the affirmation of an underlying ground of the world, the Brahman. And so Shankaracharya's contribution was to reaffirm and to systematize that Upanishadic teaching, that the Atman is identical with the Brahman. But the Buddha's dependent origination sort of undercuts both the possibility of affirming a permanent eternal self, the Atman, and the possibility of affirming that fundamental underlying ground of the world, the Brahman. Okay, we take one more question. We have to give the young people a chance.
I'm actually just trying to reframe. He said if you're sitting close, you don't need to stand. I'm just trying to reframe his question. I think I grasped it to mean, is the absence, or now I'm getting stuck, or the belief that there could potentially be like a divine creator or something of that sort, and instead of declaring with certainty under Buddha's teachings that that does not exist, he's wondering if that does exist, or it's a matter of it could exist and we just don't know, or we're just focused on our path to enlightenment. So I think that was around where he was headed. Yeah, as opposed to a dichotomy of one or the other. And from my interpretation is that there are saintly beings that could have existed amongst us, but maybe not given that same title of like a divine creator, but someone who was like an incredible person like Jesus or something.
Well, of course there are saintly beings. I mean, that's... And there are, in Buddhism, there are many realms of existence inhabited by beings that we call deities or divinities, but those are temporary beings. Maybe these are your infinite possibilities, many, many different realms of existence, more than we could conceive, many inhabited by beings we call divine beings. These are beings who are come out of the human realm and who have cultivated these divine qualities, and those divine qualities will lead to rebirth into these various celestial and divine realms. But from the Buddha standpoint, those beings are still impermanent beings wandering through the cycle of birth and death, not liberated beings. And so once they finish the lifespan in one of the divine realms, then they pass away and come back to the human realm or other realms. Okay, we'll take one more. Then it's absolutely finished.
Yes, one day. So once the consciousness leaves the body, can it take more than one form? Can it split into more than one?
Can a consciousness split into more than one?
After the death, once it leaves the body, can it?
To my knowledge, the consciousness can only take on one.
So, I don't know, I was trying to explain why the world population keep increasing. So where's the...
Yeah, what one would say, the problem is never presented to the Buddha. Apparently, at that time, maybe there was not a clear awareness of population increase. But what one would say is probably that there are other realms of existence which are emptying out, so to speak, and the beings are passing from those realms coming into the human realm. That's the only way that I could explain that. Okay, I think we will end the Q&A session and move over to the other side for the closing meditation and sharing of the merits. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, this will conduct as a guided meditation on loving kindness. Okay, so first take a comfortable sitting position. Okay, first, we're going to develop loving kindness towards ourselves individually. So first,